What a pleasure to interrupt your meal. Nonetheless, here I am. It's a pleasure to be here to terrorize you today. I have about 3 hours of material to cover in 30 minutes, so I will leave out every second, third word, and you can fill in the rest of it. At this great event, you've heard many thoughtful presentations which are well researched. This will not be one of them. I am just going to ramble on about things that I think are important to the future of the United States, our competitiveness, and to all of us. Clearly, we do live in interesting times, and I remember for a talk researching the Chinese curse that says, "May you live in interesting times." There is no Chinese curse that says, "May you live in interesting times." It's a complete fabrication, like most of what we hear in the news today, and a lot of what we hear at events purporting to look forward into the future. And one of our challenges as business leaders is figuring out what's real. Because if you listen to everything you hear, all the solutions are right around the corner. It's really simple, and if you just do this or that, it will take care of itself. And I'm here to tell you, in my experience, that's not the case. And we are facing many difficult, complicated challenges. We have an American disease called a short attention span, which means whether it's 140 character tweets or a whole variety of other things, it is becoming impossible to actually have a sustained adult public conversation about challenging and difficult topics. And why is this a problem? Because in my experience, there aren't many big problems and challenges for which there are simple answers. And in order to get to answers that are for the common good, as well as the good of our country in specific, it's time we start getting serious about these things. The problem is the mechanisms that exist for us to get serious and have those kind of conversations seems to be in jeopardy. So what I'd like to do is talk today about 3 topics. What's going on now that's different than what we've seen before, this process of innovation, creativity, and all of that. You know, where is the action, and where are the places where, in fact, it's the opposite problem? There isn't action and attention, and we need it, because you have to address both sides. These are symmetrical. It's nice to say, here are the great wonders ahead, and there are great wonders ahead, but if you don't deal with the other challenges, it prevents a drag on the future, which is extremely difficult to overcome. So I'm going to talk about 5 minutes into the future, not 50 years, not 100 years, but think about 5 minutes, stuff that is now. And how can you think about some of these amazing new innovations as people who are either creating them or potentially using them? How do you figure out what's real? And what are the priorities that matter? Because there is a common fallacy, especially an American fallacy, that good or great ideas are rare. They aren't. This room is filled with hundreds of them. The problem is we don't have a mechanism to pick which to focus on. And if you don't focus on them, they tend not to happen, because hard things don't take care of themselves. People seem to think you have a great idea, you simply introduce it to the world, and it is all on autopilot. It is exactly the opposite. Deciding is really hard, executing is really hard, and sticking with it when you are the only person or organization who believes that this is the future is particularly challenging. You can call it guts, you can call it lack of common sense, childlike idealism. And by the way, I think we should stop asking our kids to grow up, and we get a little more of childlike wonder into the process of business and competitiveness, because that's how we started. But clearly the US business model needs work, right? At a meta level, what do? We borrow money from China, we use it to buy oil from the Arabs, and then we burn it. And in the whole scheme of things, this doesn't seem like a great long-term business model, but that's why I'm not an economist. What do? Where do the visions come from? How did we end up with these protectionist immigration policies that we have now, which are doing us in? My attitude is, come to the United States, get an advanced degree. It should have stapled to it a green card for you and your family. You want to come be part of this American experiment, which is an experiment and which is ongoing, and I would argue is at risk, and come on over. I mean, I don't see many Native Americans in this room, which meant you came from somewhere else. And you came here because your parents were probably escaping a system that suppressed their freedom, or their creativity or their ability to innovate, and they came here to be part of this great experiment we call the United States. So what I'd like to talk about, a little less game, guys, I can talk louder. What I'd like to talk about is how we think about this, how we do it, what's different in the world. I mean, I grew up during the Cold War, and I recall that one of our great accomplishments was getting a certain wall to be torn down. And now we're talking about our future as building a wall. That strikes me as being a little strange. And I understand the practical realities of why they built that wall in Germany. And I understand the practical realities about we're talking about building a wall here. But what I'd like to talk to you about is just the opposite, is how do we get to the point where we don't need walls, and in fact, where we have a world with an ecosystem that works, that the United States fits into in a way that is synchronous and healthily constructive. Because we tend not to think that way. We tend to think about us. An awful lot of people in the United States have never left the United States. Many have never left the state or city they're in. So it's difficult to have a worldview in that perspective. But it is one precious planet, and we need to start thinking globally. Not just globally in terms of competitiveness, but globally in terms of harmony. Easy thing to say, hard to achieve. I would argue that technology and innovation is actually one way to achieve this. So what do we mean by innovation? What do we mean by invention? Well, you know, these are really the byproduct of human creativity. And it doesn't have to be invention in the pure sense, whereby there is some new property of physics that you have discovered and therefore you're turning that into a device that does something. It's often just putting together a collection of things in a novel way, often wrapped in a novel business model. For example, this device is changing the world. This is an iPhone, but the iPhone and the smartphones that followed are fundamentally changing commerce, the way we work, how we function. There's very little fundamental new technology here. It's a whole collection of technologies that were independently developed for other purposes and just moved forward. And this process of how things move forward is usually for different reasons. So, you know, this knows where it is because of the global positioning system. It wasn't built for cell phones. It was a Navy technology, not Air Force, by the way, Navy technology to know where ballistic submarines were because we had very accurate guidance systems, but it kind of helps to know where you start when you hit the button. And so this was a solution of I'm in the middle of the ocean, where am I with equivalent precision and knowledge of time that you require to keep these inertial guidance systems working. It then transferred to the Air Force, who didn't want it. And now it is powering the world. And in fact, if we turned the GPS system off, lives would be lost and the economy would be in serious jeopardy because every phone network, every generator system, and a whole variety of technologies in use any day have depended upon this utility, which was not invented for any of the purposes that it's being used for. The wireless phone, you know, Motorola, who invented cellular telephony, got wrong by a factor of 10 how many users there would be in their business planning horizon. And in fact, they built the Iridium satellite constellation as a very forward-thinking idea, because the notion is so much of the world won't have cellular coverage that there's a premium business for satellite coverage. But because they didn't believe enough in their own invention, it blew ahead, the whole world got wired, and then that ended up being a system mostly of use to government and specialized users rather than utilities. There was never a need for most of the inventions that changed the world, never something that you or your business analysts could look at and say, oh, that's a great idea. Electric light, if Westinghouse didn't bail out Edison, he would have gone broke. There was no demand for it. The cities were wired with gas. And the notion is, why would you put in a whole new infrastructure to do the same thing that this thing does? And people argued it's in fact more dangerous. Why? You can get electrocuted with electricity. No one has ever been electrocuted with gas. And clearly this is adding a new hazard into people's lives. The automobile, no demand for it. Serious health concerns raised by the public. It's conceivable that you die if you travel faster than 35 miles per hour. This is real. And, you know, why would you think that this noisy, smelly, strange thing would actually have a future? And I live in Los Angeles, so I wonder about that every day. Lesser things, the television remote control. how many of you, enough of you, are old enough to remember the introduction of the television remote control? And there were jokes about, we cannot believe that Americans are so fill in the spot lazy that they can't get up off their rear end to walk across the room to turn to the channel. And it turns out, yes, in fact, Americans are that lazy that they can't go across and do that. What it really did is change the way people watch television. They started channel surfing. That simple, make it a little easier to do channel surfing, and it changed the pattern of viewership, which changed the way shows were produced, which set the pathway for narrowcasting and cable and a whole bunch of other things, and now internet that followed, just by little innovations that at the time people just thought were a curiosity. The list goes on and on. The internet, I was at Disney in the early 90s, and my job was to inform our management about where the future is, and we did a set of analyses which said it's the internet, at a time where no one in the entire Walt Disney Company management had a computer on their desk, except the CFO, who had an MIS terminal connected to some mainframe where they kept Walt frozen or something like that. And, trying to convince people this is the entire future of our industry in only 20 years when no one has contact with it is really difficult. Digital photography. You may remember a company called Eastman Kodak. And one of the great American companies, 100-year-old company and such, a company you may not recall invented digital photography and did the first digital cameras and made the willful decision to slow it down because it could affect their core business, which was film. Of course, their core business has never been film. It's been memory and the memory of the world. And by making one little mistake, that mistake in their case was sort of saying, we need to slow down the future because it might hurt our bottom line. Whereas you contrast that to companies like Apple. And again, I'm not saying one's better, one's worse, but the business decision, do you know what their most successful product was before the iPhone? iPod. So iPod, music business, not their computer business, far more profitable and all of that. They introduced the phone. They give away an iPod in every phone, free. How would you like to be the product line manager at Apple, responsible for the profitability of the iPod, and have the boss say, oh, by the way, I'm giving it away in every new product we built. And so we gave away the tablet, it's a part of the computers and so forth. That's the opposite of slowing down a business. It's saying, I'm going to clean my own clock. I am going to put myself and my most profitable product out of business because I believe that there's a future that is brighter, and I'm willing to take that bet, right or wrong. Now, incidentally, keep in mind this is the company that introduced the Newton a decade earlier, which was the wrong product at the time. We didn't have wireless, we didn't have network-connected computers and mobility, we didn't have a whole bunch of things. Basically, it's the same idea. They called it personal digital assistants and so on and so forth. So timing matters, as well as these other inventions that you as a company are not going to invent. The most important invention probably in the iPhone is apps and that notion of a series of processes which allow other people to use their time and money to make your product and loyalty to your customer better. And that kind of new ecosystem, which you heard about earlier at work, whether it's co-creation or whether you see it happening in traditional marketplaces, the creation of a marketplace is a very powerful new concept. So what about here? What's going on? Where are all these changes? I'm going to draw for you because PowerPoint sucks. And by the way, if you'd like to increase the productivity of your companies, simply ban PowerPoint. You can still buy the licenses if you said, I want to hurt Bill and the other thing. But just learn to talk to each other. You'll find that if you ban PowerPoint, people wander around in the halls kind of aimlessly for a while. But after a week or two, they actually learn to do this thing called speak, followed by communication. And you might find it helpful. So there's a chart which gets drawn at every one of these kind of events. And sometimes it sort of, has a nominal middle, sometimes it has a bottom. And it has two axes. And this is time. By the way, for those of you who can't see in the back, who asked you to sit in the back? And the other one is something important. And the speaker gets up and talks about the bright new future and basically says, it looks like this. Now, we can't remember, is this logarithmic or exponential or geometric, but it's like big deals going on. So this is the number of people using wireless telephony. It's the amount of data delivered into the home. It's the amount of stuff being put on servers as part of big data. It's the number of compute cycles available in cloud. You name it. It's just kind of the future of everything. The only thing you can be sure of is you had nothing to do with it. This is just kind of a force of nature that's happening. And then they get up and draw another curve, which looks like this. That's you. That's your business. So how many of you, raise your hand if you have a landline still? A little less than half the room. How would you like to be in the landline business? On one level you say, well, it's great that we're in mobile wireless telephony. Well, you're also in the business which you still have to maintain a gigantic infrastructure, even though less and less. And you're about typical for the room. In America, about half the people don't have landlines anymore or don't use them. This is a big deal in a very short period of time. Look at how long it took to build out that wired switched phone system, and look at how quickly it becomes nearly obsolete. And it doesn't even have to be obsolete. It can still be useful and good, but your cost of maintaining it at scale versus the profitability it generates puts you at a normal disadvantage. It's this. It's, how many people are buying cars and finding their products on the internet? It's how many people are buying classified ads. Now, in the smoke-filled rooms of publishers and newspapers, they're sitting around saying, who the hell's Craig and who cares about his list, right? He wasn't a newspaper publisher. He wasn't a peer competitor. When is the last time one of you went on encyclopediabritannica.com? Do I see one hand? No hands. When you all grew up, it was the definitive encyclopedia, right? And unless you couldn't afford it, you got that instead of Americana or World Book or one of the other things. So what happened? Did you think your competitor was going to be a bunch of you who just decide one afternoon to go write an encyclopedia? Not even on people's planning horizons. You may have heard of a company called Sears. Familiar with them? How many of you had Sears catalogs when you were growing up? Right. What would have been the big deal of putting that catalog online? Okay? How come my friend Jeff Bezos had an opportunity to do anything? Why didn't the Sears or the other people? They already had it all written down. Just code it, put it on the internet, and have a nice day. But clearly what seem in retrospect like really simple decisions, by the time it occurs to you that they're really simple, is usually too late to do anything about it. So this is that. So where are we? Where are you in this room who are worried about American competitiveness? Where are you in the thing of this? Now, typically, this is when the speaker gets up and says, and we are here. Now, these are uncalibrated charts, doesn't mean anything, but those of you in business generally find this is not a good place to be, right? You're sort of heading in this. And, so they said, we're here. At which point, a gray-bearded person in the room generally says this person is an alarmist and they shouldn't be taken seriously because we're actually over here. So you should feel a lot better, right? You're on the Titanic, look at the pretty icebergs going by, and that band is great, the food's terrific, same salad, and you can sort of move yourself forward in time. But I've got news for you as to how it affects our competitiveness in the future and where we are. Young people think we're here. So young people are voting by ignoring all that other stuff and basically saying, you guys are already dead, and you're just so clueless you don't realize it yet. So, we're there. But they're wrong, as is the person who thinks we're here and as the person here. Where we are relative to the computer revolution, which is what we generally call this curve, and how it's going to change us and affect competitiveness, is we're here. Is to quote a friend and colleague of mine, Alan Kay, who, by the way, invented the idea of the personal computer and overlapping Windows interfaces and object-oriented programming, so significant contributions from one individual and his teams. Computer revolution hasn't begun yet. So all the stuff that you're seeing that is confusing, that is disturbing, that is making you think the rules of business are changing out from underneath me, computer revolution hasn't started yet. This is just the ripple of noise before it. It's changing warfare. It's changing how terrorists are recruited. It's changing how industries form, where they start in a completely distributed environment. It's changing things in a way that, if you're a traditional businessman, is very disturbing because you don't get it and you don't have the tools to make decisions in that environment. So part of the issue is, how do you get into the game? Part of it is realizing, if you're in the United States, what are we particularly good at, and how did we get here? One of the ways we got here is by diversity, by a whole bunch of different ideas and being able to put those ideas together in novel ways. I would argue a great American strength is the ability to combine, on one side, combine art and design, on the other side with science and engineering. If you look at so many of these technologies that are changing our world, the smartphone included, they are about that. The gaming business, the motion picture industry, the special effects business. This ability to do the left and right brains, probably better front and right brain, the ability to think multimodally, to be able to think creatively across domains is something we do particularly well. And maybe it's because your parents all genetically selected you because they decided to move here. And so those were the ones by definition that were entrepreneurial and able to take more risks. It's disturbing, though, because if you balance it with the trends in American industry, which are risk adversity, and I would argue we have a cancer growing in both bureaucratic government organizations as well as in big organizations that are in the commercial sector of risk adversity, where the notion is, show me how to get all the risk out of it and how we're going to make a lot of money. Great. And how hard can that be? And so the idea that risk is bad, rather, it's also the idea that failure is bad. Failure is a necessary component to success. And there is no path into the future which just says, we're going to take the lowest risk path because someone's going to take more risk than you do and clean your clock. It's as simple as that. And so the question is, how do we encourage intelligent risk taking? How do we build generations of not just entrepreneurs, but intrapreneurs which are capable of doing that? And how do we create an atmosphere where we don't kill them when they try? You know, there are really two kinds of people in the world. People who believe there are two kinds of people in the world and people who don't. But which are you? Anyway, but there really are two kinds of people, and they think about the world differently. And I would call them requirements people, who are very process-oriented and have a defined process, and you need to follow that process and have rigor and discipline. And it's a team sport, and it's about empowerment, and it's about accountability. And they're big idea people who don't believe in any of that, believe you would never ask the customer because they'll just limit your thinking to where you are, and are out there pushing boundaries all the time. Clearly, this country was built on big ideas, right? A place to go to get away from oppression and raise your family in freedom. That was a big idea. Bill of Rights, big idea. Put a man on the moon by the end of the decade and return him safely to Earth, big idea. Lots of big ideas have made this country happen. All of them were extremely risky, and yet we haven't learned from that. We also haven't learned from the fact that the inclusionary nature of the United States, which meant the best and brightest people from all over the world who shared these ideals, were all willing to come here at their own risk, and the risk of their future and their families to be part of this greater experiment. You know, there are things all around you that you're going to hear about. Cybersecurity, is it a big deal? Yeah, it's a very big deal. And it's about time we realize that it's a sufficiently big deal. It's like saying, well, how many of you have your companies don't have locks on your doors and have no one there over the weekend and just leave it open and it's fine if people wander around through? Or have picture windows on the areas you do your most serious technology development and welcome strangers to come in and take pictures. Right. Well, that's what you're doing by not taking cybersecurity seriously. And why is it so bad? It's so bad because on the internet and office computing and so forth, it's only been as good as it needs to be to keep these industries and buildings growing. And so by the time it grows, it does this, and your ability to respond by traditional means goes the other direction. I mean, this stuff is critical to our competitiveness. It is critical that you hear about artificial intelligence. When I was at MIT, all I heard about was artificial intelligence, and my mentor, Marvin Minsky, has been called the father of artificial intelligence. Reality is, it has been right around the corner as the solution to everything for 40 years, as has 3D. You know, 3D, you know, how many of you bet on 3D as a technology? Do an experiment, look at me. You're all looking at me, good. Close one eye. Is that closed? That's 2D. Open the eye, 3D. What do you think? This is, for most people, a solution in search of a problem. And that is one of the things you have to watch out for, is solutions in search of problems, solutions for which there is no corresponding problem. Doesn't mean it can't be cute, doesn't mean it can't be better, doesn't mean you can't build a fad-oriented business around it, but getting to the point of what's the real deal. Augmented reality and virtual reality. It's going to be huge, but only when it's good. Until it's good, it will be huge for businesses like gaming, where it turns out you don't have to be all that good to offer a novelty and immersion. At the same time, I have a 7.5-year-old daughter, and it's not clear to me that this is a good thing to create more immersive environments for her. This real world is something she needs to be immersed in, and so I, for one, am very cautious about, on one level, I don't believe you slow the technologies down, because that's exactly the wrong approach. But at the same time, as parents, we have to take responsibility for how we let our kids use these things, because some of it is beneficial, some of it is isolating, and I would argue we don't need more kids that are isolated from the world they're growing up in. Robotics and autonomy is going to be enormous. Now again, robotics have been around the corner for 25 years. Turns out it takes time for these things to happen in a meaningful way. Self-driving cars will totally change the way we drive cities, will totally change safety, will change pollution, will change congestion in enormous ways, and it will do it in most of your lifetimes. One of you isn't looking too good, so maybe not you, but for the rest of you, this is big. Microprocessors, again, what's happening? When does Bohrs Law run out? Well, for the past 25 years, people have been saying it's going to run out in 2 or 3 years. It hasn't, especially if you don't think about it as the size of microstructures and integrated circuits, but think of it about computational efficiency and effectiveness, which is not what he was talking about, but I feel free to interpret it that way. You know, it's going to keep going, or something else is going to keep going. Now, does it bother you how much of that we don't have the fastest supercomputer at the moment? Maybe who cares? Maybe you should care. Does it bother you that China, who does have the fastest supercomputer, didn't use American integrated circuits in it for the first time, but used their own? Big things changing. Does it matter that those core technologies developed and driven here are moving offshore? Of course it matters. Now, does it matter in a way that it should be stopped? No, of course not. Does it matter in a way that we need to be thinking about what's next and what is our positioning and all of that? Absolutely. And it means we have to be thoughtful on a national basis, on a local basis, on an educational basis. You look at network-based computing, cloud processing. This is a big deal. This is not a curious little anomaly. It is a big deal. How many of you believe you can do better security on your own computers by not putting them on the cloud? Okay, you're all wrong. The reality is, in 5% of the situations, you may be better keeping it in-house, but the fact is you can't hire people as good as the big cloud computing people hire in terms of network security. And so even though 5 years ago the view was very sensible to keep it in your own house, the view now is how many really brilliant IT people do you have? And the answer is not enough. And why? Because you're competing with everybody else in the room for a limited talent pool. So counterintuitively, the idea of moving to the cloud at this moment in time actually makes a lot of sense, but a lot of organizations aren't ready yet to understand the implications to their business problem. So PCR, CRISPR, biological frontiers, the human biome and understanding it, nanotechnology, new materials, metamaterials. The list is endless. You've heard a lot about them here. Look at the news every day, you hear more about them. The question is, how do you decide? And I would argue you decide by thinking about, what does this mean to our lives? Is this going to be stuff that impacts us in a positive way? It's important to have optimism. It's important to understand that we are not alone in the world, and that an isolationist view of we're going to do it with tariffs and we're doing all this, those are tools which are occasionally useful. What's more useful is always being ahead and thinking about how we empower our thinking to stay ahead. I would argue we have basically 6 big things to keep our eye on here. And before I even say that, this whole notion of complacency and lack of interest and engagement of people, we just elected our new president-elect with 27% of the eligible voters having voted. Now, I'm not passing any judgment on who won, why they won, or that they won, fair and square. They won with 27% of eligible voters voting for them. That seems like a problem. It seems like the involvement of the citizens in our nation is at risk. Why is that? What do we do about it? Well, some of it is that people don't trust their government. Some of it is that people don't feel empowered. Some of it is because they think their single vote doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the reasons is. What matters is this is not sustainable. Because if we do not have our people taking an interest in the competitiveness of our country, it doesn't matter what we do at conferences like this, because they're the ones who actually have to do the work. And part of the challenge is, how do you identify the things that matter? I'm almost out of time, so I just put together a little list of the big six, the things which I think, if we want to assure American, United States competitiveness retains, you have to get all of these right. The first one is vision. What is the vision for the future of the United States? And that vision is, it used to be, come here to be part of the new world. It used to be part of the space age. It used to be part of the computer revolution and go make things happen. Different answer for different people, but the fact is, from a national identity, we've lost our way. And we need to regain that way. And we need to regain it not just by waiting for a political leader, but for each of us. Everyone in this room is a leader in one form or another of how do you rekindle that to make sure that the vision for your enterprise is clearly defined in such a way that, first of all, the best and brightest kids will want to come work for you. Because the next most important thing after vision is talent. And you're not going to attract the best and brightest young people if you don't have an articulate vision and understand how to tell that story effectively about what the future is. Storytelling, the company I came from, the Walt Disney Company, before I started Applied Minds, is exactly about storytelling, the power of storytelling, what it does. I would argue the internet got to be important when it finally got good enough for storytelling. And you can call storytelling movies or newspapers or other things. Storytelling, fundamentally critical technology for the development of society. It's before we had reading and writing, how we made things memorable and remembered. I would argue, by the way, reading and writing is a fad. It's probably got another 250 years, but it's had a good run. But vision, what is the vision for the country? What is the vision for the enterprise? What is the vision for your company? And what is the vision for you personally within that? It's really important because it's the thing that keeps you going when common sense tells you it's time to give up. So talent, we need the best and the brightest, and we don't need them from here. We need them from all over the world, and we have to have immigration policies which allow them to come here at risk to themselves and make the same bet that our parents and their parents made to be part of this United States, these United States. Trust. We're at an all-time low in trust. Whether it's people trusting in their government who think that, there are government agencies who are spending most of the time spying on your neighbors and doing everything else. Even if they had the ability to do that, why would they do that? They are American citizens just like the rest of us. And the idea, though, that people believe that their government is not there to help them, but is there in some way to hurt them, this is a real problem. We need role models. How many role models? Name a public scientist, right? People say Einstein. Say, how about a living one? They'll say Carl Sagan. You'll say, okay, this is going to be a long conversation. But the reality is we have all sorts of role models in sports, musician, performers, movie stars, a whole bunch of role models there. We don't have a lot of scientists. We don't have a lot of engineers. We don't have a whole lot of people who philosophers as role models for kids. Now, in some ways, it's more fun to be a fire truck driver or a fireman or something like that. But the reality is, kids need role models. They need people they can look at and they look like me because they're the right gender, they're the right color, they're the right hairstyle. Doesn't matter what they choose to pick, but the idea is we've got to have more role models. We've got to get them out there to be able to inspire kids to think about different directions that their parents can only help them by encouraging them and exposing them, because kids will, by definition, go in a direction to break their parents' heart, right? How many of you went into the family business? Exactly. 2. So you get trust right, speed and efficiency really matter. We're in a competitive world. The old school way of doing things in big enterprises by driving down risk will put you out of business. And there are excellent examples all over the place of where and how this happens. The reality is getting to market quickly, being willing to fail fast, a rapid prototyping, iterate quickly, get up, do it again, and do it over again. Again, failure is an essential part of the process. If you attempt to take a road where you don't fail, and by the way, you don't have to fail by betting the entire farm. If you're a large enterprise, you can fail by, things saying, okay, I'm going to take 10% and I'm going to bet it on the future. If you're in your personal life, you might decide midlife, it's time to go into a whole different business. All these things put you at risk, but they're often critical as part of the process of reinvention. Storytelling. I think it is highly underrated in business. It is essential. If you look at someone like, people, again, Apple. Steve Jobs was a master storyteller. I remember when he did the Mac Air reveal and he has the manila envelope and pulled the Mac Air out. Well, I have a Mac Air and it doesn't fit in a manila envelope. So clearly he made a manila envelope of exactly the dimension for this thing to slide out. But the fact is, it was a memorable moment. All the great leaders in the world are great storytellers. I don't care if they're great political leaders. I don't care if they're great military leaders. Storytelling is a core competency to articulating vision in a way that motivates people, and we need to embrace that as part of our national enterprise and as part of all of the companies that build it. It's not taught in schools, not taught in business school. It's something which I would argue is an essential differentiator, and it's something, by the way, that we as Americans tend to be pretty good at, but we don't encourage it, and I would say that's at our peril. There's one more, which is more important than anything I've talked about, probably should have been the whole talk, and it's more important than AIDS, it's more important than the bird flu, it's more important than terrorism, it's more important than nuclear weapons, it's more important than pollution and the negative impacts on the environment. It's called education. And we as Americans, United States citizens, should be embarrassed that we've allowed the educational system of this country to reach the state of decline it's in now. If you don't believe me, go back and visit schools. They're not like they were when you were a kid. And we have a handful of great schools, and we still have great universities. But what we're feeding the universities with, right now, half the universities are foreign students. Nothing wrong with foreign students, but where are the ones from here? And part of the challenge is we have not taken education seriously, personally. As a country, I would argue we've done a mediocre job of it. I often talk in inner city schools, and the most sophisticated technology I've seen it used in the schools are the metal detectors that frisk kids for weapons going into the building, and that's a national disgrace. And I'm here to tell you, it doesn't matter any of the great wonders we've talked about today, any of the great visions for the future, any of these very real curves which are poised to change our world. We will fail with a nation full of dummies. And if we don't get ourselves serious about the education of our children, and it doesn't just mean STEM, and it doesn't just mean STEAM, it means inspiring them, being the kids who are going to have the vision of how they can change the world. Kids who feel empowered, so knowing that they, as one individual, can be the next ... fill in the lane of the leader, visionary, artist, whoever, who by themselves are able to inspire people and change the world. If you don't have kids who believe that, trust me, they're not going to grow up and do it. And part of it is role models, part of it is taking our schools seriously. Now, there are great things. There are robot competitions, there are all sorts of things, grassroots level, that are happening, generally not started by the schools. And I would urge all of you as individuals, it is a critical need to all of your companies. Why? Because you're not going to be successful with a bunch of dummies. It's a critical need to you as individuals, because your kids are not going to move out and they're going to stay there and live off you for the conceivable future. It turns out there are very personal needs why having our kids get the best shot. Our job as parents is to expose them to the wonders of the world and help them find their own way. Our job as a nation is to make sure the tools, the resources necessary for them to thrive and do that are readily available, and all too often they're not. And all too often, school is a punishment, something they have to go to because they're required to, rather than something which they are thrilled to go to because they're being exposed to the wonders of the world and imagination, etc. I am actually very optimistic. And how could I be optimistic with that as a view? It's pretty simple. It's because of this computer revolution, a bunch of whole things that are going on. This thing called the internet, which I would argue is the single most important technology and innovation in the history of mankind since language. Far more important than reading and writing, far more important than, internal combustion, all of the other things. It is going to be the voice of the world. It is going to be the way people can be inspired by people they will have never met on the other side of the planet on a one-to-one basis. And I'm not talking about replacing teachers. To say that the internet replaces teachers means you either don't know what computers and the internet do or you don't know what teachers do. But power steering for teachers. Let one teacher reach hundreds of thousands or millions of people. Let the word disseminate. This stuff that we have around us, right now, there are 7.5 billion people in the world. There are 7 billion cell phones. About 30% of those are smartphones, meaning computers. That's going to double in the next 18 months or so. It's that curve. This is our promise. The creativity and innovation, largely American, that created the internet, created wireless mobility, created online gaming, created online auctions, created Amazon, created Apple Computer, created the icons, as well as we're empowering a whole bunch of companies that people don't hear about as being the tech giants, but are equally thrilling in the innovations that they are bringing into our world. It may not be the ones you read about in the headlines, but they're all important. It's just like you need one person with a great idea, you need a bunch of people to execute it. We're all in this together. If we sit back and look at this, if we combine the storytelling capabilities of our teachers with the most empowering storytelling technology ever developed, which is the internet. Why do I say that? Reaches the largest number of people in a language they can speak at the lowest cost, and it's bidirectional. We have never remotely had anything like that in the history of this planet. So that's why I'm optimistic, but the real reason I'm optimistic is people like you. You take the time out of your day and life to come to events like this, to learn, to exchange ideas, and because clearly you are both curious and concerned about our collective futures. I would put forth to you, these concerns are a good thing. My hat's off to you. It was a privilege to be asked to come here and talk to you today. Sorry I talked too long, but it's what I do. And, I am proud of what your enterprises and your predecessors have done, but I'm going to be even more proud of how you embrace our future, empower our kids. Can I have the slide, please? That's our future. That's my daughter, Kira. And my hat's off to you. Thank you.